Okay, good morning, everybody. Now I can see myself and not any of your little faces in the little squares. That's kind of a bummer, but I guess it's better for the signage.
Hi, you can click the arrow. There should be a little grid where that says gallery view. It's like a bunch of dots and,
Yeah.
and
Oh,
squares.
cool. So now I can still see you guys. Great. Better. The other question is, if people who don't have their cameras on would consider putting them on, it helps me because if you can go like that when you're understanding and not when you're not, that helps me to get the closest approximation of being in some kind of geographical space together. Okay, so good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for getting up and getting ready to do some theory again. I don't know if you were watching last night. I've been affixed to the television way too much these last months, but last night Trump had his rally, his white supremacist rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the day after Juneteenth. It shouldn't have happened at all, both out of just decent human compassion and sensitivity around race suffering in Tulsa and the history, and also because of the pandemic, that will be a super spreader event that will go back and probably trickle down to harming the most vulnerable sectors of society. And Tulsa has a peaking COVID spike, and we know what that means for Black, brown, poor, older, chronically ill people. So I think about that, or I bring our attention to that because I'm aware, just like all of you are aware, that we're in a very unusual historical moment. And I sort of showed us yesterday that we're not just dealing with a would-be dictator or will-be dictator who's shown that he would like to use his military, use the army against our own people, and thus end our half-century plus experiment with Republican representative democracy, but it would also unleash full force white supremacy and heteropatriarchy on everybody, and this would be an immiseration event for everyone. So we're really kind of fighting, the Democrats are saying we're fighting for the soul of the country. I'd say we're fighting for our souls. And the question is about what will these protests become and what could they become? And sometimes I have these sort of imaginary conversations with Murray Bookchin, who became my mentor when I was 21. He died when I was 43. So he kind of became like, I adopted him as my dad. And I used to call him at historical moments like this. And I'd say, Murray, what are we gonna do? And he'd always have something really brilliant, believable, sort of optimistic and reasonable to say. And so I conjure him, and I've been conjuring him. And I know what he would say is that the protests are an incredible, necessary expression of moral outrage. They're a necessary expression of citizen refusal. They're necessary, but they're not a sufficient condition to create a revolution that could transform our current order, which is a statist, capitalist, white supremacist, and heteropatriarchal system. And so we have a lot of work to do as revolutionaries. And I think anybody can consider themselves a revolutionary if you have revolutionary aspirations, if you want to change the given order into an order that is dramatically so different than the system we have right now, then you're a revolutionary. If you can imagine a different economic system, that's a moral economy. I'm so sorry. My husband's phone rings on my computer. Don't know why, it just does. But if you can imagine another economic system, a moral economy that I'm going to talk about later, how that sort of blends with and meshes with and is integral to a direct democracy. If you can imagine a different political order that's not based on a state, but it's based on a confederation of directly democratic, confederated, autonomous cities, towns, and villages. If you can imagine a world where people value human life, the rest of the natural world, that people will have an ethos based on compassion and humanity, if you can imagine that, then you're a revolutionary. And the next step is, how do you figure out how to take those intentions and translate them into real action? And the first thing I want to talk about really briefly, usually again, this would be, you know, an entire course, and I'm hoping to get some of these ideas into lecture formats on video that you can just watch. Hopefully we'll be able to watch on YouTube, on the IAC's YouTube channel soon. Is that what I want, you know, if you have a takeaway, I want you to take away from this that Bookchin really tried to create a holistic philosophy where the epistemology, which makes us think and rethink about how we think about nature and society, gives rise to an ethics, which is a set of principles that are, as I'm going to describe, are really based on a set of tendencies that emerge throughout natural history towards ever greater levels of consciousness, subjectivity, freedom, and mutualism, complex forms of complementarity and mutualism. And that ultimately we derive a politics from that ethics that's derived from the epistemology. So it's really, it's a holistic philosophy. I'm giving this a very broad brushstroke. I can't give much more detail because of the constraints of time, but hopefully I will have this on video form soon. So just to review it for a second, we looked at our developmental spiral yesterday, where natural history is one continued process of accumulation, where there's not one moment in the development that's lost. Every moment is retained. So as Dan said, the pH of that you find in the oceans that gave rise to life is the same pH found in our blood. This is a completely accumulative process. And this is very important when it comes to dialectical reasoning that Bookchin really tried to elaborate. And so the question with ethics is a branch of philosophy that asks, what is the good life? What is the good society? And what are the components that help us to build a good society? What root ought, and the word ought is really important, not just what can happen or what we can imagine could happen, but what ought to happen. What role ought humanity play in natural history? Right now, 1% of humanity is destroying both human happiness, well-being, health, while destroying the planet. It's very strange to have been teaching this material for 36 years because it was hypothetical. It really was. So when I started teaching about this in the 80s, it literally was, we might see an ecological catastrophe. On Bookchin's, literally his deathbed, the day before he became unconscious, we had a very long conversation, and he said to me, Chaia, I had no idea that the climate crisis was so imminent. He thought we had 200 years to get to the point where we are now. He said, I just had no idea. And he was so shaken by that because he was an incredible humanitarian and an incredible naturalist. And it literally broke his heart. And as it breaks all of our hearts. And that's why we're here, to try to say we're not giving up. We were gonna say we want to create an ethical, ecological society that is capable of emancipating humanity and trying to play a constructive, enhancing role in the continuing process of natural history. So Bookchin takes from this dialectic that he moves, this is the epistemological piece of social ecology, of the movement in natural history from first nature to second nature, and he finds these tendencies that are consistent throughout. One is a tendency towards, and the word here is increasing levels of subjectivity and freedom, complementarity and mutual aid, and non-hierarchy. He felt it was very important to explain that sociobiologists often want to argue that hierarchy and oppression or domination are institutionalized in the same ways that they are in nature, and they're not. Human beings are the only, unless there are others, mammals who are doing this, and we don't know, as far as we know, we're the only species on the planet that institutionalizes forms of freedom and forms of unfreedom. We have that power to literally institutionalize them. But in natural history leading up to us, there is no hierarchy. There is situational dominance between species and between members of a band of primates, for instance, and it's based on physical prowess. We all know that Trump has nothing mentally or physically, no features about him that really can explain his dominance and his power in this situation. He has institutionalized power only, no mental or physical power, really. So the question is, how do you create forms of freedom and principles pulled from these developmental tendencies that Bookchin sees as we move from first nature into second nature? And this is just a simple teaching device that I've come up with myself over the years. It's a little 5-pointed star. And I pull from, this is again, this would be a much broader conversation, but it's my freedom star. And I start with a very general principle of non-hierarchy that Bookchin gleans again from a reading of natural history. And from that, we can pull the notion of direct democracy, that direct democracy is a non-hierarchical form of self-governance. It would be very, very hard to argue that direct democracy, where people gather in a citizens' assembly face-to-face and discuss and debate and make policy together in a way that's respectful, etc. It'd be very hard to argue that that is hierarchical. It's not. Moral economy applies non-hierarchy to an economy, and the economy would be recallable to the direct democracy, to the General Assembly. Direct democracy would manage our economy, citizens themselves giving workers limited autonomy when it made sense to make decisions about production and distribution. But really a moral economy is one whose principle is producing and distributing things to benefit everybody, each according to their ability, each according to their need. Ecology is a principle that Bookchin obviously derived from his reading of First Nature into Second Nature. Ecology is that science that tries to make sense of what he called eco-communities that comprise that movement from first nature to second nature. All of that history is what that stuff is made of is eco-communities. He didn't really like the word ecosystems. He thought systems theory and was a very mechanistic way of talking about ecology. So he liked the term eco-communities, which I like too. And finally, social justice and equality. Justice meaning that we have the right to be justly respected, valued, and equality, meaning that we live according to a principle of what in anthropology people call the irreducible minimum, where it would be unthinkable that there would be people who were allowed to be greedy and hoard things or money-like things. Everybody would have equality in terms of rights, duties, and they'd all be granted justice, freedom, and respect. So these are kind of 5 principles that I kind of pulled out of Bookchin's. He has a much longer list of principles, and if you read his work, you can make your own set of principles. This is one that I find useful. And in an ideal situation, what we would be doing is taking our ethical principles that are grounded in the dialectical developmental logic of natural history. I'll say that again, they're ethical principles grounded in the dialectical developmental logic of natural history. And we're gonna have this video on YouTube, so if you ever wanna like still a frame and write down these sheets, you can do that. And what's very important here about this dialectic is that Bookchin was very interested in the logic, the developmental logic that moves from the general to the particular. And every organic development moves from the general to the particular. Again, an acorn that I used yesterday's example contains a very generalized structure, genetic structure, that could give way to a very differentiated structure of a shoot going up. We have several acorns that took roots and put up a little teeny plant. But watching an acorn differentiate itself, become more particularized is fascinating, and to actually become An oak tree is a tremendous differentiation process going from an acorn. When a human baby is in utero, it's actually at the very beginning almost indistinguishable. It's hard to distinguish between the fetus, the early fetus of a human baby and a pig. A lot of mammals in their first fetal days or weeks look very similar. There's something very generalized about early stages of organic biological development. And as the human infant or fetus emerges into an actual baby, that's an infant, they all kind of have a very generalized structure as well. Sometimes you can see somebody's differentiated face in their baby pictures, sometimes you can't. And as the baby develops, they become a more particularized, differentiated version of themselves. And that is the logic of development, whether you're looking at the developments that happens over all of natural history, that happens within human development, within the plant and any kind of organic development you're looking at. Certainly the acorn tells the same story. So why is that important, that moving from the general to the particular? It's important because Bookchin felt that when you were thinking, and this is his word, he reclaims the word rationality. He really felt that the term rationality had been done wrong, I agree, by a lot of reductionist, linear, mechanistic thinkers during and after the Enlightenment. He wanted to reclaim and ecologize the word rational and say there's a logic where we can take, here's my star, the principle of a non-hierarchy as a generalized formal idea and particularize it out into what forms, excuse me, of non-hierarchy do we want to have to be the most essential features of our world? Well, you want to have direct democracy, moral economy, ecology, social justice. Direct democracy is still a generalized form or a generalized principle. On its own, it doesn't necessarily mean it's very good. You have to have generalized direct democracy particularized by people who are upholding the principle of non-hierarchy and who are upholding the principle of social justice and upholding the principle of moral ecology and ecology, moral economy and ecology. So if somebody in a direct democracy says, well, in our direct democracy, we're going to have capitalism or we're going to allow some people to hoard goods and things, you say, no, that is going against our principle of non-hierarchy and justice and equality. So all of these principles, they form a holistic gestalt, and each one, when they particularize out, they have to retain the general principle. So again, your citizens assembly has to retain the general principle of non-hierarchy, social justice, ecology. Your moral economy has to retain, when you decide to create, say, a bicycle co-op, your bicycle co-op as a general principle of moral economy has to retain all the practices, all the particular practices have to retain the general principle of non-hierarchy, direct democracy, moral economy, ecology, and social justice. So this movement from the general to particular is not just a fun epistemological idea, it actually guides our thinking. Excuse me. Now I feel very much like Murray Bookchin. He used to cough a lot when he would talk and then he'd apologize. He said, I'm so sorry. Now I guess I'm following in his footsteps. So this is a way of thinking that really allows us to be mindful and accountable and keep our eye always on our general principles and ask ourselves at every moment that we are applying principles and particularizing principles, are we staying true to our general principles? Now on to politics. I'm going really fast. Just to review, yesterday, the Symbiosis folks did a fabulous, beautiful presentation on dual power. It was so fun to get to be part of that and watch them do their thing. So I'm going to add a little bit of sort of Bookchin and his take on dual power. Bookchin really was interested in Trotsky's notion of dual power, but he felt it was not sufficiently kind of fleshed out. He really believed that Having workers' councils, the Soviets, was too narrow a unit of organizing, and the worker was too narrow a unit of social identity, that he believed it should be not the worker but the citizen, and not the workers' council but the citizens' assembly. That should be the seat of direct democracy and real, what he called, politics. So for Bookchin, dual power is the contest, excuse me, for political legitimacy and power between the municipality and its general assembly and the state. So for Bookchin, anybody who's living right now in a city, town, village, you are living in a politically legitimate, potentially legitimate unit. You could be a free city, town, village, or municipality that governs itself. That could totally happen. The people in Rojava have done it. That could totally happen. Once you get above the level of city, town, village, above the municipal level, you are now no longer engaging in legitimate political action in the true sense of the term. You're now entering the domain of the state. And in the US, that would be the state's rights or the state power, and above that is the federal government. So for Bookchin, communalist organizing engages people on the municipal level and does not advise people to organize or do political work on the state or federal level, which is, you know, what that's who has most of the power, right? Anyway, we know we're living in a pyramid where the municipalities had the least power. So that dual power contest has to really be between the city's town and state that becomes free, that makes a contest of power and legitimacy against the state. And it hollows out the power of the state and refills it with empowered, directly democratic citizens who govern themselves in their communities. So that would be very different than people organizing social co-ops, food collectives, housing collectives. I personally came of age and was socialized in housing collectives, in food co-ops, in collectives for, we worked for, to support battered women trying to escape their abusive spouses. I came of age in a culture of co-ops, and that those were, in my experience, those were prefigurative social oppositional institutions. They prefigured the organizing culture. They prefigured the sensibility of the society that I wanted to live in and that everybody wanted to live in. But they didn't ever wrest the political power that they could formalize to create a new society. And so I was 21, and all that social movement work that I did, either engaging in creating alternative social counter institutions, while that was incredibly essential, and again, I keep using this heuristic, it was necessary, and it is necessary, it's not sufficient to create a new political power and a true dual power contest for the state. The co-ops got co-opted by Whole Foods. You know, the United Way took over all of the battered women's shelters and women's health collectives, etc. And that's what happens. So now I want to talk really briefly as I move, oh my goodness, just barely got to politics here. I'm going to go really fast. Okay. I wanted just to say that people are wondering, what do you mean by the social sphere? That just so you know, you live in 3 spheres of your society. Hannah Arendt writes about this a lot in many of her works, that there's the private sphere of the home and your body that feminists politicized in the 60s and 70s and the 80s, showing these are actually are very much political because the state has a lot of influence on what happens in women's bodies and everybody's bodies and Black bodies. We see with Black Lives Matter, the state can kill Black bodies at will. The social sphere is the realm of work, play, recreation, leisure, worship, all of that. The state has its hands on the social sphere as well. It creates regulations, etc. And the political sphere, what we live in now, is the state. It should be the polis, the municipality, that's the legitimate sort of home or body of political autonomy, but it's the state. That's where we are now in history. And we live in a situation where basically the capitalism has basically invaded and controlled the social sphere of production, distribution, love, work, everything. And the state has its hands everywhere as well. How do we reclaim our autonomy in the private sphere? How do we reclaim the social sphere? And a lot of how we do that are creating these alternative social institutions, cooperatives, etc. These, again, these are necessary, but they're not sufficient for political power. In order to have a sufficient condition to create political power for ourselves, we've got to organize as citizens to create and reclaim the political sphere. And that means we have to go into creating citizens' general popular assemblies, like the people in Rojava have been doing. And ultimately, I'm moving really fast here. Basically, ultimately, we find, like I said before, that the citizen or popular assembly, right now, in many parts of the world, people do have on a municipal level access to existing legal citizens' assemblies. They can be neighborhood planning boards, school planning boards, you name it. In some cities, there are neighborhood planning boards and assemblies. All of those municipal meetings that call together citizens who are coming out as citizens who live somewhere and have a stake of some kind in the place they live, those are existing legal and valid forms of political organization and ultimately freedom. And so for many years in the 80s, I worked as part of the Burlington Greens, and our goal was, it's kind of funny, we were the Burlington Greens, we were left Greens, we identified as anarchists, and we were working to take over, to popularize the idea of communalism, which we called libertarian municipalism at the time. And we were trying to make it clear that we'd run a candidate in an election, but we were very clear that we were running a program and not a candidate, and that if our candidate won, our program would win and our candidate would fall away, and we would be advancing this program that people would be joining. And we understood that this would be a minoritarian movement and that it had to be, because we believe that every project to move from unfreedom to freedom is an incremental developmental educational project. So we were fine. Here was the minority view here was Bernie's folks, or maybe they were already here. Bernie Sanders was mayor of Burlington while I was involved in all of this, and Bernie's folks were somewhere here. We were the minority of the minority of the minority, and we worked year after year after year to try to advance a communalist program that explained what was the difference between capitalism and moral economy, and more importantly, what was the difference between direct democracy and representative democracy. B. Bookchin ran for mayor during one of our best campaigns, and we never got above, I think, 3% of the vote, which was totally fine. We were doing, literally, we saw ourselves as doing an educational project that, according to Bookchin and a lot of people, educational movements often see their effects sometimes 5 years later, 10 years later, 20. What we're seeing now in the streets with Black Lives Matter, that didn't come out of nowhere. That began the civil rights movement. Then we see BLM emerge really in 2014, correct me, or 16. And now we're seeing it, mushroom right now in this amazing way. So even doing your work in your legal existing political assemblies and trying to promote your program, even if you're in the minority, you are raising consciousness of the people around you. And if you present yourselves in ways that are likable and you promote a vision that is exciting and dynamic, and you're passionate and you're compassionate and you can communicate with people in a respectful manner, that over time, ideas can win out, good ones over bad ideas. And obviously, they can, or we wouldn't have so many good people in the streets right now standing up and against white supremacy. So I feel like this moment, at least for me, it's lovely to be sitting here with you virtually at a moment where I'm personally feeling the most hope that I've felt in a very, very long time, where people are out on the street and they're contesting, and that didn't come out of nowhere. That came out of decades of people doing organizing and educating and consciousness raising, and that we can do that in our political movements and in our political projects as well. So I think I'll stop there, and I'm not sure if we should do some Q&A before we transition to Dan's slideshow. Blair, do you have an idea? Is Blair here?
I think we should do Q&A, Chaia.
Okay, why don't we do Q&A?
Maybe someone can monitor the chat and people can put questions up or set a stack on the chat.
Sounds great. While we're waiting for that, does somebody just want to popcorn out a question or comment? Cam?
Yeah, I was hoping to get some clarification on the dialectic of developmental logic that you mentioned. The dialectic is between the general and the particular, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, cool, just checking.
Yes, and again, for me, I'm a very visual person. For me, if you literally go Google after this, fetus of a fetal pig and a fetal human, it'll blow your mind, the generality of the general nature of that form, of the organic form, and how they differentiate into very different things is fascinating. And it's true, if you look at the first unicellular organism in the oceans, that's the most generalized form of organic life that exists. And then if you look at the emergence between the development, all the developmental moments happen between that first unicellular organism and say human beings, it's kind of fascinating. Or elephants. I spent time this morning, I'm obsessed with elephants, I have to admit. I was watching these elephants rescuing a baby out of a mud pond, and it was unbelievable. The complexity of the way they're able to enact sort of empathy and compassion and collective care, and they're communicating and figuring out and strategizing how to get this baby elephant out of the mud pond. It kind of blew my mind. So you have these complex, differentiated forms of development like an elephant compared to a unicellular organism. It's not a hierarchy, it's about time. It's what time does. Time and organic life on this planet, that's what happened here.
I think the next question is from Lily. It's in the chat about different types of currencies.
So, people have had really interesting luck with experimenting with different kinds of currencies like Ithaca dollars. There's just been so many. And what they're trying to do is create, people can call it a shadow economy, an alternate economy, a parallel economy. The problem with these social experiments is, while they might be necessary to create ways for people to literally get what they need materially, and also to foster prefigurative experiences for people of being able to share with people, is actually, it creates good chemicals in our brain. So while these are both materially necessary and psychologically really helpful, they don't create a real contest of power with the state in any way. And they don't really create a contest of power with capitalism at all. So I would say they are borderline necessary. And maybe I'd say they are necessary in that they give people proof that people can be very creative in creating pre-capitalist or uncapitalist ways of meeting people's needs for goods and services. As an anthropologist, you can get that same lesson if you read about human history prior to 500 years ago. Not just 500 years ago, but Murray Bookchin used to really talk about how there was so much uncapitalist economic activity happening in the US even before the 60s, you know, after World War II, before we got, you know, the 50s really locked in and we got aggressive capitalism, late capitalism emerging in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and now, there were still, you know, human beings, we evolved, you know, 100% of who we are outside of a capitalist system. We can just study the anthropological record and the ethnographic record, and we know that we can live outside of capitalist economies, and we can do better. We have done better. But they're cool. I mean, you know, they're a cool experiment, and they can be really helpful.
And I believe the next stack question is from Abhishek.
Yeah, I really like the stuff you said about like the super minority and its role in consciousness raising, and that being like a goal in and of itself, even if it doesn't like win whatever elections.
Absolutely.
But after that, you mentioned like presenting stuff in a way that's likable, and I have some issues with that, because in our current society, who gets to be likable and who gets to portray that as well? Like abolition was not a likable idea even like a year ago, and people who were talking about abolition were like these crazy Black people, and already in the popular imagination, like Black people have been villainized and completely caricatured to the point of, same goes with like brown people, people in not white parts of the world, basically. And when the media is then dominated by the state and we don't have control over our own narratives, how can we be likable in those situations when we're posing these really oppositional ideas?
Yeah, this is why I love teaching, because whatever I say, the puzzle piece that I put in, there's one that's missing, and thank you for putting that puzzle piece next to it. You know, I taught gender studies for 35 years, and you know, one of my favorite pieces to assign students, you can find online, is the Bitch Manifesto that came out in 1960, I think 8 or 9. And it was women writing about why not only, you know, were they being called bitches in their movements by men, but why they wanted to reclaim the term of bitch, and that they were going to be bitches, and that anger, you know, feminists of color, lesbian feminists have written extensively about the importance of rage and moral outrage to any movement. And, you know, there's this, you know, I'll put that out just as a fact, that people are morally outraged, and moral outrage is very important, both as a motor of social contestation and protest and rebellion and uprising, and also just, you know, it's authentic and it's real. People have to show a reality that if you stand on my neck or on my brother's neck, I'm going to be beyond outraged. You know, I'm going to have grief. I'm going to, you know, be despondent, and I'm going to have rage. So I completely hear that. And I'm going to put that, you know, on a shelf here. Next to that, I would say, when we move into a citizens' assembly, we're moving into a space of debate and persuasion, and it's part of the democratic process. And so, whereas it might be very important to be, you know, I spent a lot of years screaming on streets with my mullet and maybe having my top off more times than needed to be, and literally just saying "fuck you" a lot, and so did everybody else around me. And when I went into the board meeting or the citizens assembly in my city, I brought a really not different set of ideas, but a different kind of sensibility about how I was going to conduct myself in that setting in an attempt to persuade people of a set of ideas that I really wanted to become popularized. And so gaining my own publicity in that public arena and trying to make ideas more popular, not in a mainstream way or a media way, but popular in the true political sense of the word, was an art form that we all had to kind of reckon with. And we were very aware that if you're a person of color going to the Citizens Assembly, you're going to be perceived very differently. If you're a queer person who you're trans and you don't pass, or if you're a disabled citizen, you're going to be perceived really differently. Everybody brings into the General Assembly their particular constraints that make them more likable or embraceable than other people. That's incredibly important to be aware of. And despite that set of constraints, we generally found that it was really important to do our best to embody and put forth a version of ourselves that did not compromise our ideals or our ideas at all, and did not muffle our anger or our outrage at all, but that we tried to put ourselves out in a way when I shouldn't, I would still say likable in that we wanted people to listen to us and we wanted to be embraced. And I will say this, people look at the civil rights movement and they look at, Martin Luther King Jr. is to me one of the most amazing examples of somebody who's able to braid together moral outrage and indignity with deep humanity and embraceability. And it was not just, Dr. Martin Luther King who did that. There were many civil rights activists who chose, and there was a lot of arguments, between the Black Power movement and folks in the civil rights movement. There's a lot of, arguments about you're trying to be too likable. I mean, that was really a debate that was very legit. And Martin Luther King knew that people had, designs to kill him, and they did. He had a lot of reason to be angry. And when you hear him speak, usually he very intentionally knew, I am a Black man in a post-slavery Jim Crow America. And if I want white people to listen to this, and I have to, because that's the only way we're going to get any traction, I've got to figure out how to be embraceable. And he did that. And all of the amazing civil rights activists figured out how to do that. And it's literally, it's poetic genius that you feel his righteous indignation and rage, and you feel his deep humanity, his deep compassion, and he was embraceable, not by complete racist bigots. No, they still hated his guts, but most of white America, who generally had bad ideas of who Black people were, saw him and thought, he's a human being. So it's a very, this issue of representation, how we communicate to the public is a really fraught one. I'm not going to pretend that it's an easy one and I have easy answers. I can just say that I respect your comment. I share your concern, and I'd say it's messy and complicated, and we just do our best to figure out in the moment how to conduct ourselves. And that's what we found to be helpful in those forums.
Can I suggest that we take a group of questions at a time that you can address?
Sure.
So we
yes, and I'll try to give
a little more
less long-winded answers. Sure.
No, not at all. But great, thanks.
Cool. So we've handed back moderating duties. I had to step out for a second. After Abhishek, I think we have Kate, Laura, Owen, and Magdalene. So why don't we take a few together? I know you'll want to answer them one by one, Chaia, so just... I
can try to answer them briefly.
Why don't we take a few? I think it's...
I'll try to do the whole spiel.
Let's take a few, and
okay.
Because we're really running out of time quickly.
Yes, I'm aware of that. I'm so sorry.
So, Kate, Laura, Owen, Magdalene?
So My question, I think, is kind of related to the previous one. And you mentioned about existing legitimate citizen assemblies, like neighborhood planning forums and things like this. And my question was about how those spaces feel so quickly and often co-opted by like the existing state power structures. So for England, it's like the local council, for example, like own that space and can control it really easily. So I wondered what that means for us as social movements. Like, do we need to be really organized outside the spaces in order to come in to the public citizen assemblies with like a sort of stronger caucus, I suppose, and that also feels a bit like controlling, you know. And I don't know if you have something to say about that.
Can I answer really briefly, because I'm gonna sort of forget what I was gonna say.
I think, well, I
Okay.
think we should take several together. Can we do that?
Yeah, okay.
So next is Laura, and then Owen, and then Magdalene. You can just jump in when the other person's finished.
I think you could probably lump my question with somebody else who asked something similar, which was to do with what Bookchin's thoughts on currency were. I've read a fair amount of his work, so I definitely got the idea that he really didn't feel that there should be any currency on the communal level, that it should be a sharing gift economy. But I was wondering if he had any idea on currency, or whether there would be any need or role for currency on the intercommunal level as opposed to the intra-communal level.
Thank you.
Owen?
Oh, and yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I had two questions that were kind of related. And I put them in the chat, but basically, is it worthwhile to engage at the local level when you're in such a conservative area? Or is it better just to move, which is what we're thinking of doing? And I will say, we did organize like an Occupy group on the shoreline of Connecticut, and it did help raise awareness. We had, 10 different towns, but at the same time, getting involved in local politics, I've served, and it's just overwhelmingly doesn't seem worth the effort. And then at the federal level, it seems like a political figure who can raise awareness, like a Ralph Nader or something, in a presidential run, can serve a useful purpose. Would you agree with that or not?
Thanks, Owen. Magdalene?
So my question's about dual power. Looking at the various dual power projects, like
Could you speak a little bit louder?
hello, how's this? How's this? Is this better?
Yes.
Okay, so my question's about dual power. Looking at the various dual power projects that exist, how would building counter institutions build a dual power that challenges the state? Because the projects I've seen so far exists in the margins of society, much less challenge the state. Like they're mostly, they end up becoming mutual aid projects, which by themselves are good, but I don't see them challenging the state. So how do we overcome this marginality in counter institutions, and how do we get more people to participate in dual power projects in a way to actually challenge state power? All right.
Can we just go ahead and take the last? Oh, sorry, Madam Magdalene. I thought you were finished.
No, I'm done. Just thank you.
I was just going to say, since we only have 3 other questions, we're obviously not going to get through all these probably in the next 4 minutes or so, that we have to hand things over and leave some time for Dan. But let's just at least flag these. Chaia, you can answer which ones seem most striking to you, and we can follow up on the others and find some points of commonality. So Joseph, you had a question on the limits of dialectics.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, it seems to me like that's the primary form of inquiry for social ecology. I'm wondering if you could comment on if that's true, or if I just don't fully understand it, and then why that is, and why not draw off of other traditions of inquiry that could make the theory more robust, potentially? Why limit yourself, I guess?
So Ginny and then Alex.
Yeah, I just dropped mine in the chat. I was just curious if you could comment on like balancing this need for this kind of deep local consciousness raising work with the rising urgency of the climate crisis and authoritarianism in like the existing nation state structure. And I always like jump back and forth between we need to like focus on like grabbing back power from the nation state as quickly as we can versus like focusing locally and slowly kind of, you know, shifting society that way. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
And lastly, Alex, and then we'll let Chaia have some final words.
All right. I guess my question was about the kind of spheres and how social ecology would kind of approach them, just because my kind of understanding of like the public and the private comes very much from feminist Marxist scholars and kind of critiquing that separation, how it came about.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just kind of, because I know that was a section that you kind of had to go quickly through, so it's just kind of a curiosity.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So we heard the questions, and how much time do I have to respond?
It's up to Dan, really. We're scheduled to go basically another hour, I believe.
Chaia, why don't you go ahead and take, 10 minutes.
Okay. They're all great questions. I'll take the first one about citizens assemblies. The person who's living in London, my eyes are so bad I can't see your name. I think you're Katie. What is it? I think it's what's really, really important, and this is kind of goes into how do you build a revolutionary movement? Do you walk as an individual into your local citizens assembly? If you do that, you're probably going to not have all that much success. However, it doesn't take that many people to cause a ruckus or to make an impact. So you could actually have an organization that's comprised of 3, 5, 10 people. In the Burlington Greens, we were never more than 12, 14 people. And if you keep showing up again and again, and you have your pamphlets, and you have now you have social media, this is before social media, and you have your message, and it's clear, and it's coherent, and it's consistent, it affects how people think. So anti-statist, anti-capitalist programs are not really co-optable by the state and capitalism. They don't like those very much. I mean, that is something we found when we pushed up against Bernie Sanders and his progressive coalition, and we challenged the legitimacy and the authority of representative democracy. We weren't going to be co-opted by the progressive coalition. They couldn't co-opt people who were taking explicitly anti-statist, anti-electoral, anti-representative democracy. We were not having, if we were making a co-op that was explicitly anti-capitalistic and anti-hierarchical, it'd be very hard if we were going to really create some kind of collaboration with a corporation. We couldn't do that, and they couldn't co-opt that project if the people who are creating that project are holding on to a principle of anti-capitalism and anti-state. And I shouldn't have brought that, that's a social project. But going back to the political, if you walk in as an organization with a name, with a set of transparent principles that you stand for, a set of policies that you stand for, you take issues in your community, and you talk about how your program would address them. And you talk about the issue at hand that's local, but you also talk about issues that are happening on a more regional, national, and global level as well. You have a far-reaching utopian vision. It's very hard to co-op an explicit anti-authoritarian program. And I'm sorry, can you hear somebody talking? I can tell them, be quiet. All I can say is going in as an individual or even two people I don't think it's impossible, but it will be very, very challenging and difficult. Hey, Alan. So sorry. This wouldn't happen at the Watershed Center. A brief word back on currency and money, sort of alternate money. These questions about in the good society, would we have money? What would we do for energy? What would we do for policing or public safety? These questions, what I would say is those are particular sets of decisions that would be made by the group of people living in a city, town, or village in their citizens' assembly, and they would be accountable to their general principles. So when it comes to figuring about currency or money, people in that assembly would think they'd have to get up, argue their point, and try to persuade their people either for or against some kind of currency. They might do an experiment and say after a few months, is this really staying true to and retaining our general principle of non-hierarchy, equality, justice, etc., ecology? They might decide yes or no. So these kinds of particularized decisions or policies, we're really talking about policies, we're not the people who are going to be making those. We can think of all of the kinds of tools we would need to bring into those citizens' assemblies to have those conversations, but we don't know what we would decide when we have a moral economy. It might be that one community decides to have some sort of currency while another community does not. And that on the confederal level, people might decide to have a confederal currency or not. But we're not the people to differentiate and particularize those general principles right now. It would be anti-democratic for me to say what that would be. The other question, of Owen, should I move question? That's a really common question that's really fair, where people are saying, you know, can I do this at home or do I need to move? A lot of people do feel at the end of the day that they do decide to move to a part of the world or the country where they feel like they're going to be kind of inspired and nourished politically, that the cultural sensibility, the leftist sensibility feeds them. A lot of people live in Vermont for that reason, northern Vermont in particular. People live where I live often. I live in the valley, it's called the Valley in Western Massachusetts, because it's less toxic. It has a lot of, I get some, in a bubble, I get to sort of be shielded from a lot of the toxic aspects of our society, and I know I get to do that based on a lot of privilege that I have. So first of all, I just want to say that question is based on often our privilege, that we have the ability and the financial means to move to some place that better resonates with our political values and the sensibility that we want to be surrounded with. Some people choose, you know what, even if I could financially move to a different city or town or village, I'm going to stay here. And I'm going to try to find like-minded people in my city, town, and village and see, can we create a movement? And can we become that minority of the minority in these public citizen forums? And some people might do that and they do it for a few years and they get burned out, and there's like, okay, now I'm either going to get burned out and do nothing or I'm going to move. I think there's no answer to that. It's a really kind of personal family question about how do we choose the kinds of places we want to live if we have the privilege to be able to find work, housing, etc. Again, this is not a choice everybody gets to make, but it is a really hard one. Personally, I would find it really hard to live in a really right-wing area, and that's just a personal thing, because I feel like I need to be surrounded by like-minded people. I need to have access to movements that I can at least go to and be part of and express my moral outrage, and also to be filled with a sense of hope as well. But again, that's a very kind of personal political kind of a question. You know, the limits of dialectics, you know, Bookchin drew from a lot of different kinds of theories. Bookchin is a philosopher. His work is philosophy, it's anthropology, it's history. He was a historian. He was a historian really for like the last 30, 25 years of his life. He wrote the Third Revolution in 4 volumes. Bookchin's philosophy does borrow a lot from the dialectical tradition, but he also borrows from a range of different philosophers who were not interested in dialectics at all. Bookchin was very inspired by a lot of native indigenous thinkers. He drew a lot of inspiration from the Iroquois Nation and the Iroquois Confederation. So I hope I didn't mean that Bookchin had a completely reductive sort of pedagogy where he just relied on a Hegelian Marxian dialectical tradition. And even if he did draw heavily on that, he so dramatically transformed the Marxian dialectic by ecologizing it. He literally called it ecologizing the dialectic, that it's very, very, very creative and innovative and new and different from what Marx was trying to do. He really blasted apart Enlightenment notions of what reason meant, what history meant, what progress meant. I mean, he shattered, you know, sort of modern concepts of what counted for progress, certainly Marxian concepts of what counted for progress. So yeah, I hope I didn't misrepresent his work by saying it's solely a dialectical approach. He was very much, he had a palette with a lot of different colors on it. And his dialectical approach was very different from dialectical approaches that preceded him. Let me see, there's one more. There's such good questions. You know, I will look over these and I will try to maybe write comments back to folks in this class. And I didn't write down who said them, but look online and I'll try to write sort of answers back to people's wonderful, really helpful questions. Oh, there's one thing on it. Balancing the need for deep local fighting nation state structures. Yeah. I mean, the thing I want to say is, my last word on this is that social ecology is not a complete, closed, static set of ideas. It's literally an evolving, maturing, open-ended dialogic process that requires a lot of people's voices to be, you know, to enter into the conversation. Social ecology is what you do with social ecology. You know, it's what I do with social ecology. It's what anybody who is drawn to this set of ideas that wants to respond to it and build on it and criticize it is completely open to do so. I certainly do not have the last word or the final answer to any of your questions. And I don't think Bookchin felt that he did either. He really felt that he was opening and building upon a mode of inquiry that's been going on for centuries. And he saw his voice as one voice among many that he valued and respected, and that this conversation is ongoing. He did not want to provide a blueprint, a recipe, a formula for how to do things. He wanted to set up a good enough, necessary set of conditions that could maybe form what's called a sufficient condition to think about how to create a revolutionary society, how to go from the current irrational is to what he saw as a rational, social, ecological, humane ought. And that's really all he tried to do during his 83 years of being alive on this planet. And it's up to you and everybody to take this conversation and try to build on it further. So I think I'll hand it over to Dan, and thank you guys so much.
Thanks, Chaia. I apologize, everyone. This is my technophobia coming to the fore. I'm just getting very anxious about this whole process right now. But I wanted to show you some slides which depict a movement which occurred back in the beginning back in the early 1970s. So it's largely Hispanic section of New York's Lower East Side. And even though these slides are ancient history at this point, and these events took place before many of you were born, I think they're really illustrative of the kind of approach, the kind of holistic approach to social change that social ecology envisions. And this is a movement that took place in a very poor immigrant neighborhood, 80% Hispanic, one of the lowest income neighborhoods in New York at that time, kind of a mini South Bronx, if that means anything to folks. The neighborhood, 40% of the property was abandoned buildings and vacant lots that were owned by the city because they'd been abandoned by the landlords. And it's a place that really embraced the kind of holistic perspective and ecological perspective that social ecology puts forth, and was quite specifically, many of these movements and many of their accomplishments were inspired by social ecology and by Bookchin's ideas, and we were directly involved in the process beginning in the early 70s, when activists from this low-income neighborhood approached the Institute and asked for some technical assistance. At that time, the ISE was doing a lot of work around alternative technologies, which included solar energy and wind power and organic agriculture and aquaculture. And all of this was at a very small scale and sort of very much a DIY ethos where people were experimenting with these things in their garages and backyards. And we were attracted to those technologies because we thought they had tremendous potential, first of all, to provide non-polluting renewable sources of energy for communities, because they could be developed on a community scale, because they could be owned and controlled, and to a certain extent actually manufactured by communities themselves. So all of this fit in very well with social ecology's approach towards creating eco-communities. This is a 30 square block neighborhood, the most devastated part of the Lower East Side. Lower East Side, of course, is the traditional immigrant portal to New York City. There are many different ethnic communities located there: Chinatown, Little Italy, there's a Ukrainian section. Lower East Side, it was the 30 square blocks, if you know New York, defined by 14th Street on the north, Houston Street on the south, Avenue A on the west, and the East River on the east. It's a tenement neighborhood consisting of mostly old law tenements built back in the 19th century. They housed various waves of immigrants over the years. There's a very, very rich history of not just immigrants and various ethnicities moving through the neighborhood, but a variety of radical movements at all. It was a hotbed of anarchism when the Jewish and Italian immigrants lived in these tenements. The Puerto Rican Socialist Party was very active in this neighborhood. Actually, Leon Trotsky lived there for a while. Emma Goldman lived there. So there's a rich history and tradition. And these mostly Puerto Rican immigrants came to Lower East Side in the 50s. The traditional model was for an immigrant group to come for the first generation to live in the immigrant ghetto that was the Lower East Side, and then to move out into other neighborhoods, into the suburbs, and to become more fully American. But when Puerto Ricans found themselves here, they said, you know what, we like being here. We don't want to move out. And the act of naming this neighborhood Lower East Side, which is, of course, the Hispanicization of Lower East Side, was really a proclamation that this is our place, this is our town, we are here to stay. But unfortunately, Lower East Side had all of the characteristics that one associates with the ghetto. High crime rates, very low employment rates, high unemployment and underemployment, high rates of tuberculosis, infestations of rats, vermin, decaying housing, et cetera, et cetera. And things only got worse in the 70s. The neighborhood was redlined by the banks so that people couldn't borrow money to improve the housing. The neighborhood was the target of a variety of anti-poverty programs. The Johnson's Great Society, Kennedy's New Frontier, Reagan's New Federalism, all of the pumped billions of dollars into this community, and things just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And finally, people took it upon themselves to start organizing at the grassroots to transform their situation, because they saw that the federal government and the city were not really helping them. Now, at this point, each block in this neighborhood, these 30 square blocks, really had its own criminal specialty. This picture on the screen is from 11th Street, and there they specialized in car stripping. But what's more significant is in the background of this slide, you can see the abandoned buildings that were really typical, that constitute between the abandoned buildings and the vacant lot that you can see in front. This was 40% of the physical territory of the neighborhood. And here the pattern was that landlords would milk rents out of the tenants, overcharging rents, even though New York had pretty stringent rent control laws. They were dealing with an immigrant population that wasn't really aware of their rights. They'd milk the rents, they'd refuse to do repairs. If windows broke, they stayed broken. If a boiler broke, well, people would have to heat their houses with their stoves in the winter. So they let things deteriorate, they sucked money out, and then they also stopped paying their taxes to the city. At that time, it's 3 years of non-payment of taxes before the city would seize the property. The landlords, at the point where the city was ready to move in, would send in arsonists to burn out the buildings and then collect the insurance. So what you were left with were burned out hulks. Next slide. Can we go to the next slide, Blair? Yeah, thanks. This is another shot, now back. Yeah, this is another shot. This is just a vacant lot. You can see the boarded up buildings in the background. This next, no, go back to the motorcycle. That's a motorcycle gang in the neighborhood. Now, more typically, we saw street gangs. There was a lot of street gang activity, people claiming their turf. The Lower East Side was also an open air drug supermarket at this time. The other motorcycle gang in the neighborhood was the Hells Angels on 3rd Street, and it's reputed that their block was the safest block in the city, because if anyone made a disturbance, they'd end up being thrown off the roof of the Hells Angels building. So next slide. At any rate, all kinds of problems, a housing crisis, crisis in food. This was a food desert. At the time, no supermarkets, people didn't have access to healthy food. There was fast food available in the neighborhood and little bodegas, but that was about it. A legal crisis, there were high rates of incarceration. Of course, we know the so-called justice system targets Black and brown people, and that was certainly the case in this neighborhood. Crisis in the schools, crisis in health, all kinds of crises. And over 100 grassroots organizations emerged in the late 60s and early 70s to address these crises. They created storefront legal clinics and storefront health clinics, and people organized to take control of the local school board. People organized to deal with housing, and housing and the environment was seen as one of the major focuses of this movement. And of course, in this kind of setting, when we're talking about the environment, we're talking about abandoned buildings and vacant lots and garbage-strewn streets. So people looked at that situation. There were a number of groups that emerged: tenants associations, block associations, housing cooperatives, and people began creating counter institutions in the community. They created a food co-op and a community credit union. Very importantly, they began to address the housing issue, and they did that through a process that they called sweat equity urban homesteading. And the slide on the screen now depicts what went on. This was the first sweat equity building anywhere in the United States, and it was on 11th Street between Avenues B and C. And 519 East 11th Street was an expression of sweat equity urban homesteading, which simply means that in a neighborhood like this, traditionally home ownership requires equity. You have to put down 15 or 20% down payment on a house. That's your equity. People here, unemployed and underemployed, didn't have that kind of financial resource, but what they had was their own labor and their own sweat, thus sweat equity. So people began on 11th Street to go into an abandoned building that had been boarded up by the city. They squatted in that building, and very soon, the next day, the HPD, the Housing and Preservation Development, which is in charge of housing in New York, sent their police force to evict the squatters. And that happened again the next day and the day after that. And then the next time the police came, there were 300 people in the street telling them to back off. And they did. So people began the process. And can we go to the next slide? Can we go to the next slide, Blair? Thanks. This is the result. On the right, 519 East 11th Street, after 3 years of sweat equity was put into it. On the left, it's twin, still an abandoned building. And people were able to use not just the skills that they had, and it took about 6 months simply to clean out one of these buildings, people working as a cooperative to do that. But they also surveyed the neighborhood and discovered that there were skilled tradespeople there. There were plumbers, electricians, union carpenters, and they were able to get them to actually provide some training to give people the skills they needed to do the rehab work of the building. Can we go to the next slide? And as a result, we're able to create decent housing, and they did that through creating low-income tenants cooperatives that had a maximum income requirement before one could become a member, to ensure that this housing remained low-income housing in perpetuity. And it was a form of home ownership. These were housing cooperatives, but people owned their own apartments, which is a pretty remarkable thing in New York City, which at this time especially was largely a city of renters. But this was really a multifaceted approach to community development. It involved all three aspects of the social ecology strategy for social change. There were oppositional movements, protest movements that protested conditions, housing conditions, conditions in the streets that organized and protest abuses on the part of police brutality, and basically every week there'd be a demonstration about one issue or another that addressed this community. And these over 100 grassroots organizations began to come together as well. And they organized alternatives using a reconstructive approach. They created, as I've mentioned, housing co-ops, fuel oil buying co-ops, credit unions, storefront, legal and health clinics, all kinds of counter institutions, a community newspaper, which was very important. Various neighborhood artists became involved, and a very vibrant and dynamic unified movement emerged. This slide on the screen now was an old oil company garage that had been abandoned, that was taken over by Chaia, a group that I've worked very closely with over the years. And they created the first recycling center in Manhattan here. And it was fascinating because one of the big problems in the community was that the sanitation department didn't pay the same kind of attention to the Lower East Side that it did to the more affluent neighborhoods that surrounded it. So the streets were full of cans and newspapers and garbage. So this recycling center was able to, pay a few pennies for various recycled goods, and local kids went out collecting cans and bottles, and soon the streets surrounding the recycling center were clean. Fascinating. And some of the kids were able to, put a little change in their jeans to buy candy or whatever. And it also provided employment for a couple of neighborhood folks. Now, a lot of the leadership, all of the leadership of this movement was indigenous. It all came directly from the community. And a lot of it actually came out of the street gangs, the Chaia organization, for example, which is a fascinating group. They actually encountered Buckminster Fuller back in the 1960s, and he taught them how to build domes. But their leadership came out of a couple of different street gangs, people who had been to jail or had seen friends go to jail or been killed, and decided that they wanted to take those energies that they devoted to the street life and devoted instead to bettering their community. And they were very powerful voices, both as organizers and as political voices speaking for the community. They were able to also, this neighborhood, as I said, has a very radical tradition. So their city council member they were able to elect was a socialist who fully supported the grassroots movement, felt accountable to it. So the recycling center is one example of the kinds of projects that they did. Over 40 buildings ultimately went into the sweat equity program. They were ultimately able to convince the city that it was worth investing in because they were creating housing, low-income housing for people at about 25% of the cost of what the state and federal housing programs were. People took the skills that they learned on 519 East 11th Street, created a carpentry cooperative, construction cooperative that went out and taught other people. They created a tool lending library. They created, also very importantly, if we could go to the next slide, a energy task force, which looked at issues of energy in the neighborhood, because this 1974, this was the first so-called energy crisis, or the Arab oil embargo. It's when Jimmy Carter put solar collectors on the White House. Anyway, could we go back? Yeah, back. Yeah, this is a picture of La Plaza Cultural, which at that time was the largest vacant lot in the Lower East Side. It was reclaimed by the community. One summer, local kids painted a mural on the wall. These murals are all over the Lower East Side. They really draw on the Mexican muralist tradition. This one depicts the multicultural heritage of Lower East Side. We see different various immigrant groups represented here. Within this cultural plaza, they created a amphitheater that was built out of rubble that had been in the vacant lot. They planted a garden. If you were to go there today, you'd see trees that we planted back in 1975 and 1976 that are now providing shade, and it's really quite a beautiful park. In the background, you can see more abandoned buildings on Avenue C. So the other thing, we can run through the slides here, go to the next. Another aspect of this work was other forms of art that really contributed to the development of this community. There was a whole movement known as the Nuyorican Poets movement, and the Nuyorican Cafe was a center of that, and really a multicultural center where poets would come and declaim and read their work. But this was not academic poetry. This was work that really expressed people's experience living on the streets. People wrote poems about winos and drug addicts and displacement. And it was a very powerful movement that ultimately actually gave birth to the whole poetry slam movement that really began on the Lower East Side. And poets like Miguel Algarín, Miguel Pinheiro, who was a poet and a playwright, wrote a play that ended up on Broadway called Short Eyes that was later made into a Hollywood movie, had a big influence on developing a new sensibility in this neighborhood, a sense that we are a community and that we have power. And through the creation of all of these alternatives, people continued to protest, and they continued their oppositional movements, and they worked together very closely. And then out of that emerged a political sphere where people created quarterly town meetings. There's a population of approximately 30,000 people in this neighborhood at that time. About half of those people were involved in the drug trade, either addicted or dealing or whatever. But a large percentage of those people became involved in this movement in one way or another. And these town meetings would have 500, 600 people attending, representatives, of course, from each of the 100 groups, but also citizens. People came together, and they came together to develop a new vision for their community. And it was a very much, in my mind, a utopian vision. It reflected their highest aspirations. And they literally developed a map of their neighborhood, their 30 square blocks, and they went building by building, block by block, and assigned responsibility for different projects to different groups and developed a comprehensive plan. This building is going to be elder housing, this will be artist housing, this is a low-income cooperative. this lot, vacant lot, will be a community garden. This one will be a playground for the kids. This will be a cultural plaza. And they developed these plans really in opposition to the official plans that the city had made for the neighborhood. At that time, the community planning boards, the official community planning boards, were made up of appointees. The mayor and the city council appointed members, and they largely drew on the business community and the landlords for those councils. And they had a very different vision of the Lower East Side. Lower East Side is about a 20-minute walk from Wall Street. It was one of the few remaining neighborhoods in Manhattan that hadn't been gentrified, and their intent was to, in fact, turn it into a gentrified neighborhood where Wall Street stockbrokers could live comfortably and safely walk the streets, walk down to their brokerage firms or whatever. And people in the neighborhood opposed that. So they created something called the Lower East Side Joint Planning Council, which formed at the grassroots, which was completely participatory and directly democratic in the way it functioned. And they began to counterpose their plans to the official plans of the city. And they battled building by building and block by block and vacant lot by vacant lot over the future of their community, and were able to accomplish incredible stuff. We can go to the next slide. This was a multi-generational movement. It grew on traditions of the Puerto Rican people who lived in this neighborhood. Turns out most of them were Puerto Rican Jibaros. They had come from the hill towns. They were small farmers, Puerto Rican hillbillies, not people who had come directly from San Juan and other urban centers. So they had a whole tradition of small-scale agriculture, and that was something that people discovered early on and were able to capitalize on. This is El Sol Brillante Community Garden. This was the first community land trust in New York City. It was established as a community garden where local people could have a small plot where they could begin to grow some of their traditional foods or other foods, whatever they wanted, or flowers. And when we began this project, people were very skeptical, you know, oh, it won't last, the kids will trash it, the gangs will take it over. But in fact, you know, it became a central aspect of the block where it was made. And the grandmothers sitting on the stoops and the kids playing in the fire hydrant would raise the alarm if anybody approached the garden with ill intent. And it's still there to this day. It's in the backyard of 519 East 11th Street. And this is a garden that was really the technical assistance starting this was provided by a woman named Linda Cohen, who was a member of the Institute. And we established a relationship with them, which was really intersubjective. It's a relationship based on mutual respect and trust, and I would suggest even love of each other. And we were mutually supportive so that we would send brigades of students down from Vermont to help them with the gardens or with construction projects. And they would send brigades of people up to Vermont to help us build geodesic domes at the farm that was our center then. So there was an exchange of knowledge there. And I'd say, for me, this was really a seminal experience. I learned much more than I taught, no question about that. It was a really inspiring experience for me. We can go to the next slide. So community gardens developed throughout.
Hey Dan, I'm going to cut you off just for a second, just because you're not giving me a spot here, but you have 15 minutes left, just so you're aware, and I think we're on the 4th or 5th slide. So
okay, I'll run through it more quickly. Thanks.
Just be time aware, yeah. And give me to get the next slide going. And I've got to click between things here.
So community gardens developed throughout the neighborhood. And in fact, Lower East Side became world famous for its community gardens. We can go to the next. And people were growing food in their basements. They were growing, we had 4x8 plywood tanks where people were raising trout. And local school kids got involved in community gardens. Next slide. Local church groups got involved. This was a project that I worked with called the Quando. Quando was a youth-run youth organization. No one older than 18 was a member, and they took over a huge abandoned building. It had been a community center that was abandoned by the Church of All Nations. They took it over and they were running recreational programs, educational programs, midnight basketball, stuff like that there, but they had no heat. I remember when I first walked in this building, it was, you know, peeling plaster and burst pipes, and they were telling me about all their big plans. I felt like I'd met, you know, Peter Pan and the Lost Boys. It was, how the hell is this huge building ever going to be made useful? But through their own sweat, through their work, with some technical assistance, with a little bit of financial assistance, they were able to create this solar heat wall on the south facade, which provided heat for one of the gyms so that they could run their programs through the winter. A huge cage on the roof. This building was a tremendous resource that had really just been abandoned. So let's continue on. You know, very importantly, I mentioned energy. I don't know if we missed the slide. I do have a slide of solar collectors on the roof of 519 East 11th Street. There it is. That was the first application of solar energy in an urban setting anywhere in the United States since the 1920s. And people were able to provide hot water for the building through these solar collectors that we helped them build. In the background, you can see the smokestacks in the upper right. That's a Con Ed generating facility. Con Ed was the electric utility for New York City. And it was a very oppressive presence in the neighborhood, spewing smoke and pollution, taking up space with their transformers. And they had a policy of shutting people off if they didn't pay their bills, even if it was in the middle of the winter. So we took on Con Ed as well, and we put up a little 1,800 watt wind generator on the roof of 519 East 11th Street. And that was the first urban application of wind-powered electricity. One of the first in the country, really. We rehabbed an old Jacobs wind generator built in the 1930s to provide rural electrification on farms back then, and fed it into the grid using an inverter. And Con Ed said, oh, you can't do that. You're going to blow out our whole grid with our little 1,800 watt generator that provided enough electricity for lights in the hallway. Ridiculous. So we took them to court. And the ruling of the New York State Supreme Court in 519 East 11th Street versus Con Ed was that Con Ed had to purchase that power back from us. And that ruling is actually the legal precedent that set the stage for the whole independent power industry in the United States, which is today a multi-billion-dollar industry. So it was significant in that sense, but it was more symbolic for us than anything else. It was a declaration of independence and an attempt to implement these decentralized, locally controlled, locally owned sources of energy in an urban setting. So we can go to another slide. At any rate, all of this really came together. This is just an interior shot of the recycling center. We can go to another one. All of this really came together in the town meetings, in the community meetings, where people came both to express their concerns and to voice their highest aspirations to create a utopian vision for their community. And it was extraordinarily successful. It was so successful that the neighborhood was transformed, that it became a place that was vibrant, that was dynamic, that was full of life and full of optimism and full of hope and extremely attractive. And in fact, so attractive that other people started coming. We saw Lower East Side had always had a large number of artists. It had always attracted creative people and radical people, but it became even more attractive now. And we started to see, you know, limos coming down at night to the little dive bars, people coming slumming. And as a result, we saw the real estate market begin to revive in the neighborhood. I remember seeing a building on 5th Street and Avenue B that sold for $16,000, sell 6 months later for $100,000, and a year after that for $400,000. And the process of gentrification began. And this is an important lesson, something that we really need to learn. Because in fact, in New York City, real estate and money, finance, are the dominant industries, and they're extremely powerful. We saw at this point landlords starting to come back and saying, hey, I'll pay those back taxes because I want my building back. We saw speculators coming in. driving up prices. We saw the birth of the Christodora House, which was the first sort of upper income co-op project in the neighborhood, where apartments were selling for $1 million, $1.5 million. It was right across the street from Tompkins Square Park, made it very attractive. So the neighborhood became more and more attractive. And unfortunately, at that point, the community really had to shift its focus from the kind of reconstructive projects and the kind of utopian development that it had been devoted to protecting itself, to fighting against gentrification. And unfortunately, it was largely a losing battle. We saw shifts in the political fortunes of the neighborhood when Rudy Giuliani ascended to the mayorship of New York. He announced when he was first elected, the era of socialism on the Lower East Side is over, whereas before we had been able to convince the city to turn these abandoned buildings over to the community for nominal sums like $100 a unit or $1,000 for a whole building. Giuliani said, no, all the remaining abandoned buildings are going on the auction market. And of course, there the speculators bid them up and up and up. He said, we're going to take back these vacant lots. And he actually, they had a literal assault on the community gardens where the police were confronting gardening activists, and there were pitched battles around those gardens, and many of them were destroyed. He brought in the bulldozers. Some were saved, some had been established as community land trusts and taken off of the real estate market. People had been able to gain legal title to many of the sweat equity buildings, so those were preserved. But the kind of expansive vision that had been in place for 10, 12 years began to atrophy and wither away as people's energies were consumed by simply trying to hold on to what they had and to survive in the neighborhood, because displacement was happening at an incredible rate. Landlords were coming in, buying people out so that they could do quick and dirty rehabs on the apartments, get them out of rent control and charge rents 4 or 5 times what people have been paying before. So there was a displacement of the largely Hispanic community there, and they were replaced by mostly yuppies. And I also have to mention at this point that there was a second wave of squatting that went on after the sweat equity urban homesteading movement. And these were largely punk and anarchist squatters who moved in. And they were not really doing much in the way of rehabbing their buildings. They did some, but they were seen by many in the Puerto Rican community as taking away properties that rightly belonged to the community. So there was some tension there, and there was some resentment there. And I think that's worth mentioning, because I think particularly in anarchist circles, there's a tendency to really romanticize the Lower East Side squatters. And I'm telling you, it was a mixed bag. And I certainly appreciated their energy and their sentiment, but at the same time, they were not really working in consort with the community. And they could have, but they chose not to. So that was kind of a distressing development as well. At any rate, let's just move through the slides real quick, and I'll wrap this up, because I know I've been going for a while. People created various kinds of cooperative enterprises. The kids at Quando started building these window box greenhouses, and they sold them to the sweat equity buildings, and they also sold them citywide. Charas built domes. They built domes for climbing structures, for playgrounds, portable housing, for camping, etc. And they sold those. Let's just go through more slides. So here's a shot of the Nuyorican Poets Cafe, which I mentioned earlier. And this was an incredibly important place where people could come and express themselves and meet others. And also through all of this, I've got to say, it was a very multicultural movement. It was a movement largely of Hispanic people, but they were very welcoming and very open to outsiders becoming involved. However, they were very clear that it's our movement. We're calling the shots. You know, often when consultants come in, the consultants take over. That wasn't the case here at all. People were very conscious and very aware of maintaining their decision-making ability and their decision-making power. But at the same time, it was a fantastic kind of multicultural milieu in which people really got to know each other and forge lifelong friendships, and were able to create real ongoing solidarity with each other. And it was based in mutualism, based in mutual respect, based in reciprocity. It was not that those of us from the outside were simply giving to the community. We were also getting a whole lot back, a lot more than we gave, in my opinion. So let's go to the next slide. And you know, throughout this period, people celebrated their community, so that every block during the summer, every block on a different weekend would hold a block festival, and local musicians, some of them world-class salseros like Machito and his orchestra, a neighborhood guy, they'd come out and play for free. The community celebrated its accomplishments and its achievements, and really developed a sensibility that was an expression of the kind of sensibility that I think we envision in social ecology, a sense of real connection, development of primary ties, face-to-face relationships, an ability to deal with the problems and the issues that their community faced at a very high level, and to do that, once again, by combining opposition, protest politics, the creation of alternative institutions, the reconstructive dimension, and the political dimension, very importantly. And their politics were extended out from town meetings into actually electing city council representatives who felt accountable to the community. I think in closing, this is Chino Garcia and Ruth Ortiz standing outside of El Bohio, which was a community center created by the Charas group in a huge school building that had been abandoned by the city. And Charas went into the school building and they created gallery space for local artists. There's a theater in the basement where they held performances. There's a gym where they had recreational programs, after school tutoring. They provided office space for many of the community organizations here. All of this is squatters. Ultimately, we're able to gain a month-to-month lease from the city for the space, a nominal sum. And it was really a center for the community, an amazing community center. And really, Rudy Giuliani's last official act as mayor of New York was to send in the cops to evict Charas and to take this building over and put it on the auction market, where it sold. However, the community continued to protest, continued to assert its own legitimate right to this space. And to this day, I think at this point it's like 23 years after that auction sale, the building is still sitting empty. This was a focal point for one of the actions we did during Occupy, actually. We had a big solidarity demonstration up here at El Bohio. A number of people got arrested. And the developer has been unable to move forward with his plans to turn this into a health and racket club for the yuppies who live in the community today. I think in closing, you know, the big lesson, one of the many lessons that I learned from this experience, was that when we had the opportunity, we really should have found some way to exert ownership and control over all of the city-owned property. And there's a model that developed out of Boston. I'm spacing out the name of it now. It's in the Roxbury neighborhood. And it was, it's documented in a book called Streets of Hope by Holly Sklar. But there, they were able to get an agreement with the city that a whole section of this neighborhood, square blocks, were turned over to the community for similar kinds of development projects. And had we been able to do that in the Lower East Side, in Lower East Side, it would be a very different situation today. So lots to learn from that experience, but for me, it's one of the best examples, domestic examples, at least that I'm aware of a process of community development and community empowerment that was very consciously rooted in the approaches that we advocate for social ecology. So I see we're at noon. I'm sure there's lots of questions. I'm sorry it took so long, and I really apologize for the confusion over the slides. I thought we had it all worked out. But now, if folks want to stick with it for a few more minutes, I could try to answer some questions.
Thanks, Dan. So, questions, comments? A lot of folks are saying what a great storyteller you are. Laura, and then Cam. Laura, you want to kick us off and then followed by Cam?
Hold on.
I think we can hear you now.
Oh, you can hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah, I was saying that as a New Yorker, my mind is really blown by this because I had no idea about any of this. I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little more on your comment at the end about if we had done this when we had the opportunity of exerting ownership and control over all the city buildings, this never would have happened. Can you just expand on that idea a little more and tell me what that would have entailed and really specifically how that would have prevented Giuliani from being able to do the sorts of things that he did in the end of going in there, sending in the police, taking over the buildings, putting them on auction? How would that process have worked?
Well, I think there were several things that were working in our favor at that point. First of all, the city considered these properties worthless.
Oh, wait, what?
The city considered the properties worthless when these projects were initiated.
Right.
They were, abandoned hulks, and it would have taken huge investment on the city's part or any developer's part to make them livable. And the whole neighborhood was redlined at that point. If people aren't aware, redlining is a process where bankers decide that they will not invest in a particular area, and they essentially draw a red circle around that area on a map and say, we're not putting any money there. So the city saw these properties as having no real value. And at the same time, folks were able to identify some sympathetic individuals in the HPD, the Housing Preservation and Development bureaucracy, people who were progressive and who saw the opportunities that this approach presented. And they were able to exert political pressure in the city council then. And, the mayor didn't object. So I think that was the moment in which we should have had a comprehensive plan and gone to the city and said, this is what we want to do, and these are the buildings that we want to do it in, and we want legal title to those buildings. And I think there was a good opportunity there that I'm not saying it was guaranteed, but there was a good chance that we could have gotten it. So that's how I would have envisioned it happening. And had that happened, then Giuliani, we would have had legal title. He couldn't have sold them off because we would have owned them. The community would have owned them. And the ownership question was that all of these were organized not as private ownership, but as low-income housing cooperatives with covenants in the deed that says the only people who can live in this apartment are someone who have an income that does not exceed, X number of dollars.
I think.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead, Laura. Sorry, complete your.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that thought. So basically, it sounds like you were able to acquire the buildings for the community on the basis of them being part of low-income housing, and so they were paying some nominal fee every month as some sort of a rent or something, but they never actually owned the buildings, and so therefore they didn't have legal title. So if they had legal title, Giuliani would not have been able to do that. Is that right?
No, they did have legal title. In the sweat equity buildings, in the 40-odd buildings that people actually had already taken over and rehab, people had gained legal title, and they did that by paying a nominal fee to the city. Once they owned the buildings, the sweat equity process continued because people had to first rehab the buildings using their own labor, their own sweat, and they were able to raise funds to do that in various ways. 519 East 11th Street located a small dairy cooperative in upstate New York run by some old socialists that gave them a no-interest loan. Then people paid a nominal monthly fee for maintenance of the buildings, and they continued sweat equity for maintenance. Everyone contributed, 8 hours a week or something like that to clean the halls and fix things up and keep things going. So there were a block of buildings that people had ownership to. They were able to hold on to those, but the vast majority of the properties we hadn't gotten around to working on yet. And they were still under city ownership, and those were the properties that Giuliani was able to sell. Now with the vacant lots, most of them were simply abandoned lots that people squatted in and created gardens in and didn't bother to even think about a legal title for. Some were, a few were. And what happened in the interesting was that when Giuliani started bulldozing them, an entertainer named Bette Midler stepped forward, and she gave $1 million to actually buy a number of those gardens. And they've been established in a community trust now, but that community trust is not really controlled by the community. So it's kind of an irony that some of those gardens still exist, but they're no longer really community gardens.
Just, I think I stepped in as host for the next few minutes since Blair had to jet. So I think maybe we'll try to go about 10 more minutes. I know that'll put us a little bit over, but then give people still a good break. I see questions for Stack from Apurva and Cam, so maybe we can take those two and take those together. If that's all right, Dan?
Sure.
Yeah, my question was about the sweat equity program. It seems like a really interesting and useful way to set it up. You were talking about this a little bit in your last answer. Now, could you just tell me more about the sweat equity program? Was people's output based on a quantification of their input?
Are we taking multiple questions, or should I address that?
The other person said Apurva says doesn't need to ask their question, so go ahead.
Okay. Yes, sweat equity was not quantified. It was basically people worked all the time. If they were unemployed, they worked there like a job. If they were underemployed, they worked there after work and on weekends. And each person would claim a particular apartment. There was work on all of the collective space first, and then people designed and renovated their individual apartments as they liked. And some of them were really quite beautiful. I mean, people put a lot into this. So the sweat equity was not quantified. It was a collective process, and people knew who was a part of the group and who wasn't. And it was an arduous process. It took 5-6 years in some cases to actually rehab a building. And you saw a lot of people who'd start out, and then, you know, something would come up, somebody get sick, or they'd move away, and then someone else would come in to take up the slack. But there was always a core of leadership that emerged in each building who helped to ensure continuity and to make sure things were coordinated and that they were getting done. I just went back last summer to an incredible reunion at 519 East 11th Street, a celebration of that achievement. I think it was, geez, how many years? Must have been the 40th anniversary or something like that.
Wow. And then there's a question from Mike in Somerville, and he asked, I'm not sure if you know the answer to this, Dan, but if the Boston example you were referencing, is that the tent city that Mel King was involved with?
No, it's actually, I've remembered the name. It was called the Dudley Street Initiative. Dudley Street Initiative is what it's called. And it was, when I first encountered it, a guy named Gus Newport was the director of the Dudley Street Initiative, and he was a black guy who was a former mayor of Berkeley.
Great. Well, I don't see any more questions or folks getting on Stack in the chat, so maybe we can stop here, and then we'll be back at same deal as yesterday, 1:30 Eastern time, and Mason and Katie and I will lead another session about dual power, organizing, and symbiosis. So look forward to seeing you all there.
And just before we go, a little bit of shameless commerce. As Blair mentioned, I wrote my doctoral dissertation about Loisaida, but I also wrote a novel about it, which is just simply called Loisaida. and check it out if you'd like to get another perspective.
Thanks, Dan. I put a link to that in the chat for anyone who's interested.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dan and Chaia, so much. Wonderful way to start us off today.
Great.
All
Thanks,
right.
everyone.
See everyone in a bit.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.